Alright folks, this nugget's actually pretty simple. It's Group Policy Part 5, and it really only has two main components. One of those is software restriction policies, the other is App Locker, which they're similar in that you can allow or deny certain applications from running. For the most part, IT folks will use these policies to deny people from being able to run certain applications. Now, for this topic, we're really just talking about, locking down software, and I don't really have a lot of whiteboard for this because most of what you need to learn will be in the actual demo. But for the most part, we'll take a look at the general idea for these two methods, the first one being the software restriction policy. This is really designed for, legacy Windows, Windows XP, Windows Server 2003, earlier version of 2008. So it's kind of really what it's designed for, and certainly it's not bulletproof. It is somewhat easy to bypass. Now, your average users won't be able to figure it out, but someone who's persistent or who has more computer savvy knowledge than the average user would be able to figure things out, especially when you work with what we call the path rule. That might be fairly easy to bypass. Also, by default, when you enable software restriction policies, all apps are allowed by default, and then when you make specific configurations, you add in individual apps that you don't want people to run. Okay, so that's how it's going to be with a software restriction policy, but App Locker takes a different perspective. First of all, it's designed for current versions of Windows, as you can see here, Windows 7 and Windows 8. This is Enterprise and Ultimate, by the way. Windows 8 R2, not the first of Windows 8, Server 2008, but the R2 version, and then all of Windows Server 2012 as well. This is going to be less easy to bypass. If you use just a path rule, then it could potentially be as easy to bypass as a software restriction policy. And we'll talk about what those are, by the way, as we get there. But if you use a hash rule, or more particularly if you use a publisher rule, that's going to be much more difficult to get around. And the publisher is probably where the big strength is in App Locker. Also, all apps are denied by default. In fact, you have to be very careful about configuring App Locker, because if you just do it part way, you could really lock yourself out of a Windows system. So you need to make sure that you create what we call the default rules, which allows anything in program files in the Windows directory to run, so you can at least boot the operating system. Alright folks, I want to tell you something here. I wanted to demonstrate how you can lock down certain applications, and I will still do that for you. However, in the past, with previous versions of Windows, I've just opened up an application that you would normally want to prevent in the workplace. Maybe Minesweeper or Solitaire, something like that. So here on Windows 8, I decided, hey, let's try it with these games. Well, first of all, I clicked on games, and the resolution that I have to record at doesn't work for the games, even though it's an HD resolution. So these must be some pretty high-res games going on here. And on a desktop computer where I had full use of the screen, I clicked on games, and it told me that I had to go to the store, the App Store here. The App Store. Oh, heaven forbid that I should say App Store during Microsoft training. I'm probably going to lose my certifications over that. Anyway, so I clicked on Store, and guess what? Now you have to go to the store to get any games, even Solitaire or Minesweeper. Yeah, they're pretty fancy and all of that. But anyway, that's what you have to do. So instead, I'm just going to type Notepad. This has gotten to be just about as boring as it can possibly get now, hasn't it? So anyway, there it is. Let's say that we did not want people to run Notepad. What kind of things could we do? Well, one of the first things we could do is to create something called a software restriction policy. If I go up here to Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, and then back to the same location we were at in our last nugget under Security Settings, you'll notice that we kind of looked at software restriction policies there in our last nugget. We didn't really spend any detail on it, though, but we will here, where we'll right-click to choose New Software Restriction Policies, and then what we want to do is to identify what we want to do with this. First, however, there's some kind of, definitions, if you will, about this whole thing, and some parameters under which any additional rules that we create will run. So, for example, with enforcement, what's it doing? It's going to apply restriction policies to all software files except libraries like DLLs. That's kind of important because a lot of DLLs are actually tied to multiple applications, some of which you might want to restrict and some of which you don't. That you can apply software restriction policies to all users or all users except local administrators. That might be a smart thing to choose right there because there's certain applications you don't want your users to run, but that administrators could run, such as Solitaire, if we could get a hold of it. Anyway, there would also be software restriction policies regarding certificates. So you can enforce certificate rules, which means that they have to be signed by a trusted certificate, or you could ignore that, which is the default right there. I'm going to leave all of these at the default, however. Then there's the designated file types. This has to do with how we identify which kind of applications actually run. You know, a .exe file, obviously that's one type. But there's other types of things that could execute as well, such as various types of scripts. You know, Windows batch files, you know, executables, which you see right here. You know, there's things you might get from the internet, you know, HTA files, which would be an HTML application. All those sorts of things. MSIs, MSPs, you get the idea. Okay, so these are all the default ones. That's a pretty good list, but you can add additional ones if you want to, like, you know, .jic or something like that. Okay, and so we could just do whatever we wanted to there. And then we could identify any trusted policies, rather trusted publishers that we could work with as well. But we're going to just go ahead and go here to, first of all, security levels. We can see here that the basic idea is that right now it's really hard to see, but there's a tiny, tiny little mark on that last little icon. Here, I'm going to run a little zoom tool here and see if we can zoom in on this thing. Let's try this. Can you see there's a tiny, tiny little checkbox on that item? That indicates that that's the one that we're currently using, and that's the default. And so when we double-click on that, basically the idea here is that we're not restricted at all from running software. So everything that I've done so far does not prevent Solitaire, or if we had it, or Notepad or anything else from running. We can also kind of blacklist everything, which would say we could right-click here and choose Set as Default, and that would mean no software runs except for what we make exceptions to. And then there's this next one here with a basic user, which allows you to run basic applications even if you're not an administrator. So that's kind of the idea with that one. But generally speaking, we start with unrestricted, and then we add additional rules for things we don't want to be able to run. Now, there's certain paths here, like registry paths, that we do run unrestricted, because if you lock those down, Windows might not run. So you have to let the operating system do its thing. Okay, but we could do several different types of rules. Number one, we could do a certificate rule, which has to make sure that a specific application is signed by a trusted certificate. We could do a hash rule, which I'll come back to in a moment. A network zone rule, which would apply to where we got the application. Okay, so it could be from a trusted internet zone or a non-trusted internet zone, for example. And then there's also a path rule. So with the path rule, all that does is it says if a specific executable of some kind or application is in a given file path, then don't let it run. So I could say a new path rule here, and then click Browse. By the way, you're probably already thinking ahead of me and saying, James, couldn't someone just take that application and put it in a different file location and still be able to run it? Yes, they could. That's kind of the whole point of why this is not a very strong rule, by the way. By the way, I think Notepad is under System 32. Anyway, so that's the path rule that I'll have here, and it'll be notepad.exe. And I'm going to just confirm that file path here offline, and then we'll be able to continue. Yep, I went ahead and checked, and that's where that file is located. So we've got notepad.exe, and the security is going to be disallowed. So once this group policy object applies, they will no longer be able to run notepad.exe. And let's see, it seems like I'm missing. Oh, I know what it is. I still have to link this to the specific organizational unit where that computer account, of course, is located. That's going to be in Tucson desktops. At least I think that's right. Let's double check. And there it is. Okay, so now that we've got that linked to the appropriate organizational unit, when that policy applies, then we should no longer be able to run Notepad. Alright, and then so I tried to run Notepad just now, and you can see that we now get a nice, cute little error message from Microsoft saying that we have to contact our system administrator. So anyway, that's how we can restrict those applications. Now, the problem with that's going to be the user, if they're fairly well educated, they might be able to just take a specific application and run it from somewhere else, or install it to a different directory path, or run it from a thumb drive. So another option that we could work with here, and let me just go ahead and change this policy to something else. Oops, on the wrong one there. Let's go to taking a look at the correct one. Here we go. Let's go to, again, Policies, Windows Settings, and then Security Settings. And then again, software restriction policies. We went into additional rules, and then again, we could get around this just by putting notepad.exe on a thumb drive or something like that. But the other thing we could do would be a new hash rule. This would be a very common way to do this, by the way. And if we browse for this one, then we can just go again to Notepad, And I'm going to quickly just get there and find Notepad real quick here. Okay, and there it is. And click Open. Okay. Now, once that's been done, again, we will disallow this. The issue with this is it will take Notepad, that specific executable, and it runs it through a calculated hash, and it will disallow that one. And of course, you can see the other options, which kind of explain themselves. But what we will do with this now is, I could leave this one in as well. It wouldn't hurt anything. I'm going to go ahead and delete it now for simplicity's sake. But now what's going to happen is, when someone tries to run Notepad, it also calculates the hash against the local copy of Notepad that they're trying to run, for example, on their Windows 8 computer. If the hash matches, then it will not allow that application to run. Now, the problem with this is you have to maintain this regularly. First of all, notice that it does show a version here, a very specific version of Notepad. Well, what if Notepad, .1 comes out? Then it might be, 16385, a different version, and then this hash would no longer apply. I'd have to create a different hash here. So you might have a different hash for every version of Notepad. So as I get back to my server here, you're probably wondering, James, there must be a better way. Well, I assure you there is. First of all, I'm going to clear out all these software restriction policies because I don't want them to interfere with what I'm about to do next. And I'm also going to delete this link here. So we'll delete that. And I want to show you the other method for being able to control your software. And that would be through something called AppLocker. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new group policy object here. I'll just call this AppLocker. And what we do with this is we go to a similar location in the policy. So we go down to Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, and then we go down to Application Control Policies down here. Okay. And now what this is going to do, it's going to be a different method for controlling things, and it's much better than using software restriction policies. This is kind of old school, the way you do it with Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows Server 2008, back in that kind of generation and before. Now, starting with Windows Server 2008 R2 and with Windows 7, you want to probably be using application control policies. You can use both of these. It's just that you have to really watch out because you don't want to use both software restriction policies and application control policies in the same policy. You want to create separate group policy objects for each one of those restrictions. Why is that? Because what will happen is the AppLocker half will apply, and then the software restriction policies will be ignored. So this could really leave you in kind of a half-locked state. So you really want to put those restrictions in separate policies. But for backwards compatibility, you probably will need to have the software restriction policies still for your older operating systems. Okay, so for our application control policies, however, what we're going to do with this is we're going to just go ahead and expand down to AppLocker. Let me just explode this up. And we're going to go into AppLocker here, and then we're going to go ahead and create our enforcement. Now, the basic idea behind AppLocker is that everything is blacklisted except for what we specify in this. Okay, so what we would assume is that nothing can run except for what we allow. So in order to make this work, what do you have to do with this? Well, first of all, these are the kinds of things that we can restrict. Packaged apps, scripts like VBScript, for example, or PowerShell, for example. Windows installer rules so that we don't want certain applications to be installed. And executable rules, which is probably where we'll spend most of our time. Now, the thing you'll also do, there's actually three parts to this. There's a service you have to start on the client computer. We'll have to create a separate policy for that. Then there's also the AppLocker properties themselves, and then there's the executable rules. For example, in this case, which applications I want to allow to run. AppLocker takes the perspective of blacklisting everything and allowing nothing to run except for what you specify here. Okay, so right now, if I were to go up to AppLocker, right-click on it, and choose Properties, I could choose to configure this for executable rules and enforce the rules. If I click OK right now and then go to lunch and don't do anything else, guess what I've just done? I've probably locked out Windows itself because this would allow nothing to run. It locks out everything. So I'm going to cancel this for the time being because that's not what we really want to happen quite yet. What we want to happen first, and I strongly recommend you do this, is that we right-click on this and choose create default rules. What that does is it allows all of the Windows applications to run. For example, the Windows folder and the program files. If we hadn't have done that, it would have blocked those locations. And I've actually demonstrated this before for a large crowd at Tech Mentor a little while back. If I did not create all of this, but I did enforce the executable rule, then it would prevent Windows itself from running. All we get is a black screen. So you have to be very careful with that. The other thing I could do, it doesn't really make any sense in this case because I haven't installed a lot of other applications and things that my client computers would use. I mean, I've got SQL installed on this server. But otherwise, what I could do is to install all of the RSAT tools on a Windows 7 or Windows 8 reference computer. In other words, a computer that typically has all the applications that my users use, and then I could right-click on this on that Windows 7 or Windows 8 computer and choose Automatically Generate Rules. And what that does is it will scan various path locations like program files, applying them to everyone. And then what it'll do is it'll look at the file hash or a path, and it will create these rules for us, and it will generate specific exceptions for different kinds of applications that it finds. Now, that would be most useful for any applications that install outside of program files or outside of the Windows folder, and that does often still happen. So what that would do is it would allow those applications then to run. Now, in my case, what I want to do is I want to make an executable rule for something I don't want to allow to run, and that would be Notepad. Now, right now it can run. Why? Because Notepad is located in a child folder under Windows. Okay, so it's still going to be allowed to run. So I have to specifically disallow it by right-clicking to choose Create New Rule, and then I'm going to go ahead and go through the wizard to deny everyone from running a specific application. I can do it by publisher, path, or file hash. In this case, let's go with publisher because this is very, very useful, and it's probably where a lot of administrators are going to be working right now with this particular way of enforcing our applications. But I'm going to go here to, let's see, C, Windows, System 32, and then we had Notepad, didn't we? Notepad. And there it is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Now, this is what's very handy about this. Look, I can say I want to allow 6.2.x.x and above to run. So that way I don't have to chase down every single file hash, for example, of every conceivable version of Notepad. Just anything from this version and above. I can also use custom values and say, hey, look, we were working with the really ancient version of Notepad. I don't know. 1.0 or something like that, and above. And now nothing from any version of 1.0 or above would be able to run. Okay, so that would be a custom value that I could set. By the way, let me go back to that. You can also do and above, and below, or exactly. So only this one version of Notepad would be able to run. And that can be kind of handy, not for Notepad particularly, but for other applications we have where we've tested that specific version, but we know that the older version that's a lower number has some bugs in it we don't want. And the newer version, we haven't had time to test it out yet, so we really don't want that one to run either. We just want this version only to be able to run. So that's another option that you could use. Notice this slider here. I can say, I'm not so concerned about the file version, but just anything that's called Notepad. Okay, so now this is our baseline right now. Okay, the further we go down, we establish the baseline down here at the version number. Now we just want to say anything called Notepad. Okay. Now we just want to say anything from the Microsoft Windows operating system. Now this would cause a lot of problems because guess what? Most of Windows is Microsoft Windows operating system. And then you could go up to the publisher, any publisher, and so on. So this would mean, in other words, no publisher could be able to run any application. Again, this would probably lock us out entirely. So in this case, we'll just leave it where it is, and I think we'll be fine with that. When we go up to these higher levels, this really applies not to all of Windows, but really only to this one specific executable in this particular case. Okay, but we're okay with what we've got right now, so I'm going to click on Next. I could also choose Add an Exception. So I could say add an exception for a specific publisher of that application. Okay, I'm okay with what we've got right now. And then we could enter a name to identify the rule. I'm going to leave the default, but it's kind of convoluted, kind of a long name, but that's okay. And then the other thing we would have to do is to enable a specific service that's called the Application Identity Service. Now, where is the Application Identity Service? There's a couple of different ways we could do this. We could go up to System Services here, and I'm okay with doing this in the same policy, but otherwise we try to divide our policies into their own group policy objects. But I'm going to go to the Application Identity. By the way, don't go to Application Experience. because that's an easy one for people to click on and say, okay, I want to have my users experience certain applications running but not others. That's not the same thing. We're looking only for the application identity service, and we could define this to start up automatically, and we could also edit security if we want to, but we shouldn't really need to do that. Now what will happen is the next time that the computer either restarts or refreshes this policy, that service should go ahead and start. Now if you want some more flexibility in this, let me show you another way you could also start that service. That would be to go down to Preferences, and then we could go into our Windows, actually we would go down here, wouldn't we? Control Panel Settings, and then we can see here we have services down here as well. The same service should appear if I right click here and choose a new service, and again it's the Application Identity Service. So we'll go ahead and just set this to automatic, and then we'll browse for the specific service, the Application Identity Service or App ID Service. We select that one. We can also say wait timeout if the service is locked. Just give it 30 seconds in case there's a problem with that service. And we can also specify who to log in as. We're not going to change it from the default, so it's just going to be the way it is, and we could work with that. Now before I refresh this policy over on my client computer over here, let's just go ahead and confirm what services we currently have running. Actually, I guess I'll go to Control Panel, So I'll go to Control Panel over here to Settings and Control Panel, and we should be able to see what services we have going on. And I can't remember exactly where it is, so I'm just going to type services here. Do it the easiest way. Oops, services. And then we're going to view the local services. And then having done that, we can see that the Application Identity Service right now is manual and it's not started. Okay, so let me double click on it to show you. It's manual and it's stopped. Okay, so what I want the policy to do is to trigger this to start up for me. All right. So before I do anything else, I'm going to go over here back to my Windows 8 computer. I've just gone to the services to confirm that it's manual startup type and it's currently stopped. And I'm logged on as a non-admin, so I can't start this anyway. You know, all these are dimmed out. So now what I want to do is to go ahead and make sure that that service will start. Oh, and one other thing, I almost messed up here. Let's go back into this. The service action right now is no change. This means that if it's not started now, it still won't start. If it's already started, it won't stop. So what I want to do is to start the service as well. That's another area where this preference has possibly a leg up on a policy, because with the policy I'd have to wait for the computer to restart or something like that. Here, when the policy refreshes, it'll immediately start that service as well, giving me a little bit more immediacy over there. So now I'm going to go to the Windows 8 client computer. We can see here that I've already gone to services. We can identify that it's a manual trigger and I cannot start it because I'm not logged on as an administrator, and indeed it is stopped. So if I go over here to run a GP update and then refresh this console here in just a moment, we're going to see that the service starts up, and it starts up as now a startup type of automatic. So let's go ahead and refresh the screen here. We see that it is running and it is automatic. Okay, so now this policy should take place where we will be able to restrict Notepad from running. Now let me tell you one other thing here. This is kind of weird and I don't have an explanation for this. You would think that Notepad would immediately stop running. However, if we go try to run it, let's just go ahead and do that. Let me go down here. Try to run it. Then we could type Notepad, and it seems to be running. I did all the steps. I went in, created the policy correctly. I started the service, which should interoperate with that policy that I just created. So how come Notepad still runs? For some strange reason, there's kind of a tape delay for how long this thing takes to kick in. It's a couple of minutes or so before this will actually start to work, and it's one of the only things where I've seen this kind of a strange delay take place. Most other policies, as soon as they refresh, they will take place unless there's strange things such as folder redirection, which may require you to restart the computer, things like that. But this isn't one of those items. This one you just plain have to wait for. So I'm going to pause recording and come back in a little while and refresh it and see if we, and take a look at Notepad again and see if we can run it. Alright, so I did have to actually leave for a few moments because my wife called me out to the kitchen. She wanted to show me something on Facebook. Oh, thank goodness for Facebook. So here we go with Notepad now. Of course, we're blocked now because the application ID service is running and we properly configured this particular, actually, where was it? Our particular executable rule that I showed you here earlier to deny Notepad. Now let's take a look at other stuff though. Notice that it's only Notepad we're blocking. Everything else, including whatever's in the Windows directory and its children, should all work still. So if I click OK here and try to run something else, do we still have Calculator, or do we have to download that too? Yeah, okay, thank you. We still have Calculator. And of course that runs because even though it's in the allowed path and there's no specific rule denying it from being able to run. In this nugget, which is Group Policy Part 5, we address two ways of restricting software. You can't actually use these to allow software, but for the most part, IT departments use them to restrict software. First of all, using software restriction policies, which, remember, is primarily designed for the older operating systems. However, AppLocker is a much more effective way to restrict software, and you should use it whenever you can. You may have to use both of these to address your older desktops as well as your newer desktops using AppLocker. But using AppLocker, you can work that with Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows Server 2008 R2, and Windows Server 2012, and I suspect for any future versions of Windows that come along as well. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.